In the early 90s, the center of the cultural scene of Las Vegas was really university focused. It really was coffee houses and bars, and that's where the energy was. Those were where all the music venues were.
Anything cultural was on Maryland Parkway for a long time. I think because its proximity to the campus, but back then it was pretty much the center of town.
Maryland Parkway was the center of commerce. It's city planning 101. This is where you put your hospital. This is where there's the big movie theater. This is where there's the university. This is where the airport is located, and all the restaurants and businesses in between.
Maryland Parkway was the backbone for the whole incipient art scene.
You had some great record stores, the best in the city. You had the radio station and the culture surrounding that. And then the anchor to all of it were the cafes.
We had a wealth of coffee houses and artists and poets and musicians all being engaged at the same time.
There was constantly good music and poetry and just interesting things happening.
We all had a scene. Everybody knew each other, and we'd pull other people in.
It blossomed because there was kind of a social movement. There was a lot of things that were sort of coalescing that made the early 90s feel a little bit like the late 60s.
The cultures were starting to come together, and there was a real openness to that within our community.
There was that whole blending of that punk DIY, do-it-yourself ethic, that whole bohemian, we're going to do it, we're going to hang it out there, and we're going to dance, and we're going to have fun with it.
It was the hub of anything that was happening, that was underground, that was creative, it was exciting.
We were challenging what was basically a notion that everything happened on the Strip, that all the art happened on the Strip, that all the entertainment was on the Strip.
It helped me to know that there were other people who were creating, who had a place in Las Vegas, where they had an outlet.
And so it really became this sort of thoroughfare of easy space, and people would find their niche.
We were in this together, and we were just trying to make something happen and make it work. And it did for a while.
Culture in Vegas in the late 80s, early 90s was lacking, perhaps, unless you knew where to look. You had to really dig for it. If you knew people in bands, you could find some culture. If you went out to the gigs in the desert with a generator and a couple bands, beyond that, it was pretty lacking.
People don't realize just how small Vegas was just that short time ago. It was huge swaths of just desert.
I grew up here in the 1980s in Las Vegas, and it lived up to the phrase cultural wasteland, at least from my perspective. In the 80s, if you wanted, art or culture, you got in your car and you drove to LA if you grew up in Vegas. There was no place to do things. There were no venues. There was no cultural infrastructure.
I'm from Vegas, grew up in Boulder City, and I went to UNLV. When I started in 1985, there was really nothing going on Maryland Parkway. There was no decent coffee shops.
In 1986, I believe, I opened up the newsroom on Las Vegas Boulevard at Carson, focusing on coffee and literature and chess and history and stuff like that.
So yeah, the newsroom was a place where people could come in the morning, mostly downtown casino workers. You'd have all sorts of odd people come in because it was an international newsstand and some word would get out.
A friend of mine and I like to go out and hang out there. And then it was kind of fun to go downtown, and the way the newsroom downtown was set up, it was really kind of small and lots of different newspapers from all over the world, magazines and so on and so forth.
It was what I wanted. It's what I'd seen in traveling. These places where people would just come together and drink coffee and talk and laugh and play games, and there wasn't anything like that in Las Vegas. The first day we opened, we were busy as we could be, and it stayed that way for a long time, until the time where we were faced with eviction for demolition purposes.